Sarah Martinez sat in the small hangar office watching the morning news with growing concern. The weather reporter stood in front of a satellite map showing a massive storm system moving toward the remote mountain villages of northern Guatemala. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, and the rivers were rising fast. Flooding is expected to worsen throughout the day, the reporter announced. Several mountain communities are now completely cut off from road access. Sarah turned off the television and walked toward her small plane, a reliable Cessna 180 that had served her well during her 5 years as a bush pilot. She worked for Wings of Hope, a small humanitarian organization that provided medical supplies and emergency aid to remote areas. Her plane wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and dependable. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria Santos, the director of Wings of Hope. Emergency situation developing in San Miguel village. Need immediate supply drop. Are you available? San Miguel was a small indigenous community nestled high in the mountains, home to about 200 people who lived mostly by farming corn and beans on terraced hillsides. Sarah had flown there many times before, delivering medicine and sometimes evacuating sick villagers to hospitals in the city. She knew the landing strip well, a narrow dirt runway carved into the mountainside that required careful navigation even in good weather. She quickly typed back, "Ready to go. What supplies needed?" The response came immediately. Medical supplies, water purification tablets, emergency food rations. Radio contact lost with village since yesterday. Local authorities requesting immediate assistance. Sarah began loading her plane with the requested supplies. She had done this routine many times, but something felt different today. The storm clouds gathering in the distance looked more threatening than usual, and the wind was picking up. As she checked her equipment, another pilot arrived at the hangar. Jake Morrison stepped out of a sleek corporate jet, wearing an expensive leather jacket and designer sunglasses. He worked for Global Relief International, a large humanitarian organization with significant funding and modern equipment. "Looks like we're both heading to the same place today," Jake said, gesturing toward his impressive aircraft. The jet was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems, satellite communication, and could carry 3 times the cargo that Sarah's small plane could handle. "You're going to San Miguel too?" Sarah asked, continuing to secure her cargo. "That's right. My organization received the same emergency request. We've got a full medical team on standby and enough supplies to help the entire village," Jake replied confidently. "This baby can handle any weather condition. GPS navigation, automatic pilot, the works." Sarah nodded politely, though she couldn't help but notice that Jake seemed more interested in showing off his equipment than discussing the actual mission. She had worked with corporate pilots before, and while they had better resources, they didn't always understand the unique challenges of flying in mountainous terrain during bad weather. "The weather reports are getting worse," Sarah mentioned, pointing toward the dark clouds. "The mountain passes can be tricky when visibility drops," Jake waved dismissively. "That's what all this technology is for. These mountains might be challenging for smaller aircraft, but this jet can fly above most weather systems." Both pilots completed their pre-flight preparations and filed their flight plans with air traffic control. Jake's jet was scheduled to depart first, followed by Sarah's smaller plane about 30 minutes later. The plan was for both aircraft to coordinate the relief effort, with Jake's larger capacity handling the bulk of supplies and Sarah providing backup support. As Jake's jet taxied toward the runway, Sarah noticed several news crews had arrived to film the departure. Global Relief International had apparently alerted the media about their emergency mission. The sleek jet made for impressive footage as it accelerated down the runway and climbed steeply into the cloudy sky. Sarah waited for her turn, using the extra time to study weather reports and review her route to San Miguel. The meteorological data showed the storm was intensifying faster than expected, with heavy rain, strong winds, and low clouds moving into the mountain region. The ceiling was dropping rapidly, which meant visibility would be severely limited. She tried calling the village radio operator one more time, but there was still no response. This wasn't unusual during severe weather. The remote communication equipment often failed when power lines went down or antennas were damaged by storms. Finally, it was time for Sarah to depart. She started her engine and began the familiar routine of pre-takeoff checks. Unlike Jake's computerized systems, her plane relied on mechanical instruments and her own piloting skills. She had learned to fly in these mountains from an experienced bush pilot who taught her to read weather patterns. understand wind currents, and navigate by landmarks when electronic systems failed. As her Cessna lifted off, Sarah could see the storm system approaching from the west. The clouds were lower and thicker than she had expected, and she knew the flight to San Miguel would test all of her experience and skills. She tried to establish radio contact with Jake's jet, but received no response. This could mean several things. Either he was already beyond radio range, experiencing communication difficulties, or focused on navigating through the deteriorating weather conditions. The landscape below began to change as Sarah flew toward the mountains. The familiar green valleys and small towns gave way to steeper terrain and denser forest. She could see flooding in some of the lower areas, with muddy brown water covering roads and surrounding houses. About 45 minutes into the flight, Sarah encountered the outer edges of the storm system. Rain began hitting her windscreen, and turbulence started to rock the small aircraft. She reduced altitude slightly and adjusted her course to follow a river valley that would lead her towards San Miguel. The weather continued to deteriorate as she flew deeper into the mountains. Clouds pressed down from above and visibility dropped to less than a mile. Sarah was now flying primarily by instrument navigation, occasionally catching glimpses of familiar landmarks through breaks in the clouds. She attempted several more radio calls to both Jake's aircraft and ground control, but the storm was interfering with communications. This was becoming more challenging than she had anticipated, but Sarah was determined to reach the village. She knew that people were waiting for help, and every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death for someone in need of medical supplies or emergency aid. The mountains ahead disappeared completely into the thick, dark clouds as Sarah continued her careful approach toward San Miguel. The storm hit with full force as Sarah navigated through the narrow mountain valleys. Rain pounded against her windscreen so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. The small Cessna bounced and shook as wind gusts caught it from different directions. But Sarah maintained steady control, her hands firm on the yoke. She had flown through bad weather before, but this storm was more intense than anything in her recent memory. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the dark clouds that surrounded her aircraft. The turbulence was getting stronger, forcing her to reduce speed and fly more cautiously. Through her headset, Sarah heard fragments of radio chatter from other aircraft in the area. Most pilots were turning back or requesting permission to land at alternate airports. She tried once more to contact Jake's jet, but there was still no response from Global Relief International's aircraft. The GPS display in her cockpit flickered occasionally due to the electrical interference from the storm. Sarah wasn't overly concerned about this. She had learned to navigate these mountains using traditional methods long before GPS became standard equipment. She recognized the shape of certain ridgelines and knew which valleys led toward San Miguel. As she flew deeper into the storm, Sarah began to worry about Jake and his crew. The sophisticated corporate jet might have impressive technology, but mountain flying during severe weather required experience that couldn't be programmed into computers. She knew that automated systems could sometimes make dangerous decisions when faced with rapidly changing conditions. The altitude readings on her instruments showed that the terrain below was rising steadily. San Miguel sat at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by peaks that reached much higher. In clear weather, the approach to the village required precise navigation through a series of mountain passes. In these conditions, it would be extremely challenging even for an experienced mountain pilot. Sarah's fuel gauge showed she still had plenty of range to reach the village and return safely, but she was burning more fuel than usual due to the headwinds and the need to maintain higher engine power in the turbulent conditions. She made a mental note to calculate her fuel consumption more carefully as the flight progressed. About an hour into her flight, Sarah finally received a weak radio transmission. It was garbled and difficult to understand, but she thought she heard Jake's voice calling for assistance. The signal faded before she could respond, and despite several attempts to re-establish contact, she heard nothing more. This was troubling news. If Jake's aircraft was experiencing difficulties, there might not be anyone else in position to help. The nearest airport with emergency services was more than 100 miles away, and other rescue aircraft would have difficulty reaching the area in these weather conditions. Sarah pressed on toward San Miguel, hoping that Jake had simply experienced a temporary communication problem and was continuing safely to the village. She knew that the corporate jet had more fuel capacity and better instruments than her small plane, so it was possible that Jake was already approaching the landing strip. The landscape below was completely hidden by clouds and rain. Sarah relied on her instruments and her knowledge of the terrain to stay on course. She could feel the aircraft being pushed around by wind shears and downdrafts, requiring constant adjustments to maintain altitude and heading. As she approached the general area of San Miguel, Sarah began looking for breaks in the clouds that would allow her to see the ground and locate the landing strip. The village was built on a plateau surrounded by higher peaks, and the runway was carved into the hillside at one end of the settlement. Through a brief gap in the clouds, Sarah caught a glimpse of flooded terrain below. What should have been green fields and forest was now a muddy brown landscape, with swollen streams and rivers. She could see that several areas that were normally dry land were now underwater. The flooding was clearly worse than anyone had anticipated. This meant that the people in San Miguel were probably in serious danger, cut off from all outside help except what could be delivered by aircraft. The urgency of her mission became even more apparent. Sarah began her approach procedure, carefully descending while watching for any sign of the village or the landing strip. The clouds were thick and low, making visual navigation nearly impossible. She would have to rely on her instruments and hope for a break in the weather at just the right moment. As she descended through 9,000 feet, Sarah finally saw something that made her heart sink. Through the swirling clouds and rain, she spotted wreckage on a mountainside below. The twisted metal and scattered debris could only be the remains of an aircraft that had crashed into the steep terrain. The wreckage appeared to be silver and white, matching the colors of Jake's corporate jet. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized what had probably happened. The sophisticated aircraft, flying too fast and too high for the conditions, had likely become disoriented in the clouds and struck the mountain. She circled the crash site once, looking for any signs of survivors, but the wreckage was scattered across a steep, rocky slope that would be nearly impossible to reach on foot. There was no movement visible, and no emergency signals from survival equipment. Sarah faced a difficult decision. She could try to land somewhere nearby and attempt a rescue, but the terrain was too steep and dangerous for her aircraft. She could call for emergency rescue services, but they wouldn't be able to reach the remote crash site for many hours, possibly days in these weather conditions. The people in San Miguel were still waiting for desperately needed supplies, and she was now the only aircraft that might be able to reach them. If she delayed her mission to San Miguel, people in the village might die from lack of medical supplies or clean water. With a heavy heart, Sarah transmitted the crash coordinates to emergency services and continued toward San Miguel. She knew that Jake and his crew would have wanted her to complete the humanitarian mission, even though she couldn't help them now. The weather seemed to be getting slightly better as she approached the village area. The rain was still heavy, but the wind was becoming less turbulent. Sarah began preparing for what would be a very challenging landing on a short, wet runway surrounded by mountains. She made several passes over the area where San Miguel should be located, looking for the familiar landmarks that would guide her to the landing strip. Through brief gaps in the clouds, she began to see signs of the village below, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears about the flooding situation. Through the breaking clouds, Sarah could see that San Miguel was in desperate trouble. The usually peaceful mountain village was surrounded by muddy floodwater that had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. What should have been neat rows of houses and cultivated fields was now a collection of isolated islands, connected by rushing brown water. The small river that normally ran quietly through the center of the village had become a raging torrent, carrying away anything in its path. Several houses had been completely swept away, leaving only their foundations visible above the waterline. Other buildings were partially submerged, with water reaching halfway up their walls. Sarah could see people gathered on rooftops and in the upper floors of the few two-story buildings in the village. They had clearly been forced to evacuate their homes and were now trapped by the rising water. Some villagers had climbed trees or taken refuge on higher ground, but even these elevated positions looked precarious as the flood continued to spread. The landing strip presented its own serious challenges. The dirt runway was partially underwater at the lower end, where runoff from the surrounding hills had created a temporary lake. The upper portion of the strip appeared to be above water, but Sarah could see that it was muddy and soft from the heavy rain. She circled the village several times, trying to determine the best approach for landing. The normal landing pattern would bring her aircraft over the flooded area at low altitude, which could be dangerous if she encountered unexpected wind currents or downdrafts caused by the water and terrain. During one of her passes, Sarah noticed people on the ground waving frantically at her aircraft. They had obviously heard her engine and knew that help was finally arriving. The sight of the desperate villagers strengthened her determination to land safely and deliver the emergency supplies. Sarah also observed that several villagers had gathered near the upper end of the landing strip, which was the only area that remained above water. They seemed to be working together to prepare the runway for her landing, moving debris and rocks that might damage her aircraft. The weather was slowly improving, with the heaviest rain beginning to diminish and the clouds lifting slightly. This gave Sarah better visibility, but it also revealed the full extent of the flooding disaster. The village was completely cut off from the outside world, with all access roads either washed out or blocked by landslides. She could see that the flooding had affected more than just the houses. The village's water well was contaminated by muddy floodwater, and the small medical clinic was partially submerged. The supplies she carried, water purification tablets, medicine, and emergency food, would be absolutely critical for the survival of these people. Sarah began her approach, carefully lining up with the usable portion of the runway. The approach would have to be steeper than normal to avoid the flooded area at the lower end of the strip. She would also need to touch down as close to the beginning of the dry ground as possible and stop quickly before reaching the water. As she descended, Sarah could see the faces of the villagers more clearly. Adults held small children in their arms, and elderly residents sat on whatever dry ground they could find. Their expressions showed a mixture of relief and desperation, relief that an aircraft had finally arrived, but also the desperation of people who had lost their homes and possessions to the flood. The final approach required all of Sarah's skill and experience. Wind currents created by the floodwater made the aircraft difficult to control, and the wet runway ahead looked shorter than she remembered. She maintained steady airspeed and kept the aircraft aligned with the center line of the strip. At the last moment before touchdown, a strong gust of wind pushed her aircraft slightly to the right. Sarah quickly corrected with rudder and aileron inputs, bringing the plane back to the center of the runway, just as the wheels touched the muddy ground. The Cessna bounced once on the soft surface before settling firmly on the runway. Sarah immediately applied the brakes and used reverse thrust from the propeller to slow the aircraft as quickly as possible. The plane skidded slightly on the wet ground but remained under control as it came to a stop with about 50 feet to spare before the floodwater. As soon as the propeller stopped turning, villagers began running toward the aircraft. Sarah quickly shut down the engine and opened the door, stepping out into the muddy, rain-soaked environment. The first person to reach her was Carlos Mendoza, the village leader who spoke some English. "Thank God you made it," Carlos said, his voice filled with emotion. "We thought no one would be able to reach us. The flooding started 2 days ago and it has not stopped rising." Sarah began unloading the emergency supplies while Carlos explained the situation. "We have lost 12 houses completely. The clinic is flooded and all our medicine is ruined. The well water is contaminated and several people are already getting sick from drinking floodwater." As more villagers gathered around the aircraft, Sarah could see the extent of their suffering. Many people were soaked to the skin and shivering in the cool mountain air. Children clung to their parents, frightened by the disaster that had destroyed their familiar world. Elderly residents looked exhausted from the stress and physical demands of evacuating their homes. "How many people need to be evacuated?" Sarah asked as she handed boxes of medical supplies to the villagers. Carlos conferred with other village leaders in their indigenous language before answering. "We have counted 180 people who are safe, but we cannot find 15 villagers who lived in the houses that were washed away. We do not know if they escaped to higher ground or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Sarah realized that she was looking at a much larger disaster than anyone had anticipated. Her small aircraft could only carry a few passengers at a time, and multiple flights would be needed to evacuate everyone who wanted to leave the village. However, the weather conditions and limited daylight would restrict how many trips she could make safely. "I need to radio for additional help," Sarah told Carlos. "There should be other aircraft coming to assist, but I'm not sure when they will arrive." Carlos's expression became more worried. "Another airplane was supposed to come here today. We heard it flying overhead about 2 hours ago, but it did not land. Do you know what happened to that plane?" Sarah's heart sank as she realized she would have to tell these desperate people about Jake's crashed aircraft, and the likelihood that no other immediate help was coming. The villagers were depending on her small plane to save their entire community. Sarah took a deep breath before explaining to Carlos about the crashed aircraft. She spoke gently but directly, knowing that the villagers needed to understand their situation clearly in order to make good decisions about who should be evacuated first. "The other airplane had an accident in the mountains," she said. "I was able to report the location to rescue services, but it means that my plane might be the only help you receive today." Carlos translated this information to the other villagers, and Sarah could see the worry spread across their faces. They had been counting on significant assistance from the outside world, and now they realized they were mostly on their own. "How many people can you take in your airplane?" Carlos asked. "4 adults maximum, or maybe 6 if some are small children," Sarah replied. "The plane isn't very big, and I need to keep enough fuel to make multiple trips safely." The village leaders huddled together to discuss who should be evacuated first. Sarah could hear intense conversation in their native language, and she understood that they were facing impossible choices. Everyone wanted to leave, but the limited space meant that families might be separated and some people would have to wait for later flights. While the leaders talked, Sarah walked through the village to assess the flood damage more carefully. The water level appeared to have stabilized, but it was still very high. Many houses were completely uninhabitable, and the villagers who remained would face serious challenges even after the flood receded. She found the village nurse, Elena Ixcot, trying to treat patients in a partially flooded building that served as the medical clinic. Elena had managed to save some medical supplies by moving them to higher shelves, but most of the clinic's equipment and medicines had been ruined by the muddy floodwater. "We have several people with serious medical problems," Elena explained. "Mrs. Morales is diabetic and has not had her insulin for 2 days. Little Miguel has been having trouble breathing since yesterday, and I think he needs to get to a hospital quickly. An elderly man hit his head when his house was swept away, and I'm worried about a brain injury." Sarah realized that the medical evacuations would have to take priority over other considerations. People with life-threatening conditions couldn't wait for additional rescue flights that might not come for days. "Can you identify the 4 or 5 people who most urgently need medical attention?" Sarah asked Elena. "Yes, but it will be very difficult to separate families. Mrs. Morales has 2 young grandchildren who depend on her. Miguel's mother will not want to let him go alone." This was the heartbreaking reality of disaster rescue operations. Sarah had faced similar situations before, but it never became easier to tell desperate people that there wasn't room for everyone on the first flight. When she returned to her aircraft, the village leaders had finished their discussion. Carlos approached her with a written list of names. "We have chosen the people who should go first," he said solemnly. 3 adults who need medical care immediately, and 2 children who are very sick. But each of these people has family members who want to go with them. Sarah studied the list and realized she would have to make some very difficult decisions. Her small aircraft simply couldn't carry all the people who needed to leave urgently. She would have to choose between medical priorities and keeping families together. "I can take 4 adults or 3 adults with 2 small children," she said. "If I try to carry more people, the airplane might not be able to take off safely from this short, muddy runway." The next hour was one of the most challenging of Sarah's career. She worked with Elena and Carlos to identify the people who would definitely die without immediate medical attention. Mrs. Morales needed insulin that could only be obtained in the city. Little Miguel's breathing problems were getting worse and required hospital treatment. An elderly man named Vicente had symptoms of internal bleeding from his injuries. For the 4th passenger, they chose Miguel's mother, Rosa, who was also having health problems and could accompany her son to the hospital. This meant leaving behind Mrs. Morales' grandchildren and Vicente's wife, which created emotional scenes as families were forced to separate. As Sarah prepared for takeoff, she promised the remaining villagers that she would return with additional supplies and would try to arrange for more rescue flights. She knew that weather conditions were improving, which would make future flights safer. But she also knew that her small organization had limited resources. The takeoff from the muddy, shortened runway was challenging but successful. Sarah's aircraft climbed steadily away from the flooded village, carrying 4 people who desperately needed medical attention. Through the passenger windows, her evacuees could see their damaged community growing smaller below them. During the flight to the city, Sarah radioed ahead to arrange for ambulances to meet her aircraft. She also contacted her organization's headquarters to request additional pilots and aircraft for continued rescue operations. The response was encouraging. 2 other pilots were preparing to fly to the area as soon as weather conditions improved further. She also reported the coordinates of Jake's crashed aircraft to the Rescue Coordination Center. A helicopter rescue team was being organized to search for survivors, though the chances of finding anyone alive after several hours in the severe weather were not good. Mrs. Morales sat quietly during the flight, holding the hand of little Miguel, who was having difficulty breathing in the thin mountain air. Rosa, Miguel's mother, prayed silently in her indigenous language. Vicente, the injured elderly man, was unconscious but stable. As they approached the city airport, Sarah could see that the weather was much better at lower altitudes. The storm had been concentrated in the mountains, and the coastal areas had received much less rain. This gave her hope that the rescue operations could continue throughout the afternoon and evening. The landing was smooth, and ambulances were waiting as promised. Sarah watched as her passengers were loaded into the medical vehicles and transported to the hospital. She felt satisfaction knowing that these 4 people would receive the treatment they needed. But she also felt the weight of knowing that many more villagers were still waiting for help. After refueling her aircraft and loading additional emergency supplies, Sarah prepared for her second flight to San Miguel. The weather reports showed continued improvement, and she was determined to evacuate as many people as possible before nightfall made flying too dangerous. As she taxied toward the runway for her return flight, Sarah received radio confirmation that 2 additional rescue aircraft were en route to assist with the evacuation. This news filled her with relief. The villagers of San Miguel would receive the help they desperately needed. Sarah's second flight to San Miguel took place under much improved weather conditions. The storm had moved east, leaving behind clearer skies and calmer winds. As she approached the village, she could see that the floodwater had begun to recede slightly. Though most of the settlement remained underwater, the villagers had been busy during her absence. They had cleared more debris from the landing strip and had organized themselves into groups based on evacuation priority. Sarah could see that they had also started the heartbreaking process of salvaging what they could from their damaged homes. When she landed, Carlos greeted her with both good news and bad news. 2 people have been found safe who we thought were missing, he reported. They had climbed to high ground and were trapped but not injured. However, we now know that 4 villagers were definitely swept away by the flood. We found some of their belongings downstream, but no sign of the people. Sarah felt sorrow for the families who had lost loved ones, but she had to focus on helping the survivors. She had brought additional medical supplies and water purification equipment that would be critical for the people who remained in the village. "How many people still want to be evacuated?" she asked. "About 30 people have asked to leave today if possible," Carlos replied. "These are mostly families with small children and elderly residents who cannot survive in these conditions. The rest of us will stay and begin rebuilding our community." Sarah was impressed by the resilience and determination of the villagers. Despite losing their homes and possessions, many were already talking about how to repair the damage and prevent similar disasters in the future. For her second evacuation flight, they had selected a family with 3 small children, whose house had been completely destroyed. The parents, Juan and Maria Cooks, had lost everything they owned and had no way to care for their children in the flooded village. The family would stay with relatives in the city until San Miguel could be rebuilt. Sarah also evacuated an elderly woman who had been injured during the flood and needed medical treatment for a broken arm. The final passenger was a teenage boy who had volunteered to accompany the elderly woman and help her navigate the city hospital. As Sarah prepared for takeoff on her second evacuation flight, she received encouraging radio contact from another rescue aircraft. Captain Rodriguez, flying a larger twin-engine plane for the National Emergency Services, was approaching the area and would arrive within an hour. "This is great news," Sarah radioed back. "There are still about 25 people who want to be evacuated, plus emergency supplies that need to be delivered." The flight to the city went smoothly, and Sarah was able to deliver her passengers safely to family members who were waiting at the airport. Word of the disaster had spread through the immigrant community in the city, and relatives were arriving to help however they could. When Sarah returned to San Miguel for her third flight, she found that Captain Rodriguez had successfully landed his larger aircraft on the improved runway. His plane could carry 8 passengers, which would significantly speed up the evacuation process. "I heard about the crashed corporate jet," Captain Rodriguez told Sarah as they coordinated their efforts. "The rescue helicopter found the wreckage, but unfortunately there were no survivors. The pilot appears to have become disoriented in the storm and struck the mountain at high speed." This news saddened Sarah, though she had expected it based on what she had seen of the wreckage. Jake and his crew had been trying to help people, just like she was, but the dangerous mountain weather had claimed their lives. Working together, Sarah and Captain Rodriguez were able to evacuate most of the remaining villagers who wanted to leave. Sarah's smaller aircraft was perfect for carrying individual families, while Captain Rodriguez's larger plane could handle bigger groups. By late afternoon, they had successfully evacuated 32 people from San Miguel. The remaining villagers had chosen to stay and begin the process of rebuilding their community. These hardy mountain people had survived floods and other disasters before, and they were determined to restore their village. During the final evacuation flights, Sarah learned more about the individual stories of the flood victims. She met a young teacher who had lost all her books and school supplies, but was already planning how to restart classes for the children who remained. She evacuated a farmer who had lost his entire crop, but was discussing with other villagers how to replant when the flood receded. One of the most touching stories came from an elderly man named Don Alberto, who had lived in San Miguel for over 80 years. He had chosen to stay in the village despite the destruction because, as he told Sarah through Carlos's translation, "This mountain gave me life, and this mountain is where I will die. But not today. Today I will help rebuild our home." As evening approached and the light began to fade, Sarah and Captain Rodriguez completed their final evacuation flights. They had delivered several thousand pounds of emergency supplies, including water purification tablets, medical supplies, emergency food rations, and tools for cleanup and rebuilding. The village leaders had organized the remaining residents into work teams. Some people were focused on draining water from buildings that could be saved. Others were cleaning up debris and salvaging usable materials. A medical team was treating minor injuries and monitoring the health of villagers who had been exposed to contaminated floodwater. Sarah was impressed by how quickly the community had organized itself for recovery. Despite losing so much, the villagers were working together with remarkable efficiency and positive spirits. Children were helping adults move debris, and elderly residents were sharing their knowledge of previous floods and recovery efforts. Before departing for the final time that day, Sarah met with Carlos and the other village leaders to discuss ongoing support. Her organization would continue to provide supplies and assistance during the rebuilding process. Government agencies were also mobilizing resources, though it would take several days for road access to be restored. "You saved our community today," Carlos told Sarah as she prepared to leave. "Without your flights, we would have lost many more people. The families you evacuated are safe because of your courage and skill." Sarah felt humble in the face of such gratitude. She had simply done what any experienced pilot would do in the same situation. The real heroes were the villagers themselves, who had survived a devastating flood and were already working to rebuild their lives. As she flew away from San Miguel in the gathering darkness, Sarah could see lights beginning to appear in the few buildings that still had power. The village would survive and the community would emerge stronger from this disaster. 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to San Miguel to check on the village's recovery progress. The transformation was remarkable. The floodwater had completely receded, leaving behind rich, fertile soil that would actually benefit the villagers' crops in the long term. What had seemed like total devastation was gradually revealing itself to be a disaster that the community could overcome. The landing strip had been improved during the recovery effort, with government workers adding gravel and better drainage to make it more reliable for future emergency flights. Sarah's landing was much smoother than it had been during the crisis, and she was greeted by many familiar faces. Carlos met her at the aircraft, but he looked completely different than he had during the flood. Instead of the exhausted, worried expression she remembered, he now seemed energetic and optimistic. He wore new clothes donated by relief organizations, and his smile was genuine. "Sarah, welcome back to San Miguel," he called out as she shut down her engine. "You must see what we have accomplished since you saved us." As they walked through the village, Sarah was amazed by what she saw. Most of the houses had been repaired or rebuilt, often with improvements that would make them more resistant to future floods. The villagers had learned valuable lessons about drainage and construction techniques that would serve them well in years to come. The medical clinic had been completely reconstructed on higher ground, with modern equipment donated by various humanitarian organizations. Elena, the village nurse, now had better facilities than she had ever had before the disaster. The flood was terrible, but in some ways it has made our village stronger, Elena explained as she showed Sarah the new clinic. We have better communication equipment now, more emergency supplies, and we have learned how to work together more effectively during a crisis. Sarah visited several of the families she had evacuated during the emergency. Mrs. Morales had returned to the village after receiving medical treatment in the city. Her diabetes was now well controlled with proper medication, and she had been reunited with her grandchildren. She insisted on showing Sarah her new house, which had been built with elevated foundations to protect against future flooding. Little Miguel, the boy with breathing problems, was completely healthy and running around the village with other children. His mother Rosa had decided to stay in the city for several months to be near better medical facilities. But she brought Miguel back to visit the village regularly. The most touching reunion was with Don Alberto, the elderly man who had refused to leave during the evacuation. He had become something of a local hero, organizing much of the rebuilding effort and sharing his decades of experience with younger villagers. At 83 years old, he was still working every day to help restore his beloved community. That old airplane pilot saved more than just the people she carried out, Don Alberto told Sarah through Carlos's translation. She gave us hope when everything seemed lost. She showed us that the outside world cared about our small village. Sarah also learned about the long-term impact of the disaster on the broader region. The flooding had affected 17 villages in the mountain area, and her successful rescue mission at San Miguel had served as a model for other emergency responses. Government officials had studied her approach and incorporated her techniques into new emergency preparedness plans. Captain Rodriguez, who had assisted with the later evacuation flights, had recommended Sarah for a National Humanitarian Service Award. The recognition would bring attention to the important work being done by small organizations like Wings of Hope, potentially leading to better funding and resources for future emergencies. The investigation into Jake's crashed aircraft had been completed, and the findings were both sad and educational. The corporate jet's sophisticated navigation systems had malfunctioned in the severe weather, providing incorrect altitude readings that led the pilot to believe he was flying higher than he actually was. The automated systems that were supposed to make flying safer had actually contributed to the accident. This tragedy had led to new safety recommendations for high-altitude flying in mountainous terrain during severe weather. The aviation community had learned important lessons that would help prevent similar accidents in the future. As Sarah prepared to leave San Miguel after her follow-up visit, the entire village gathered to see her off. The children had made drawings showing her airplane bringing supplies during the flood. The adults had written letters thanking her for her service, and several families had prepared traditional foods as gifts for her return journey. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Carlos presented Sarah with a hand-woven textile created by the village women, depicting scenes from the flood and rescue. The colors and patterns told the story of how the community had survived the disaster and emerged stronger. This tells the story of our flood and how you helped us, Carlos explained. But it also shows our future, how we will be ready if another disaster comes. We will never forget what you did for us, but more importantly, we have learned how to help ourselves. Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction as she flew away from San Miguel for what she knew would not be the last time. The village had not only recovered from the disaster but had grown stronger and more resilient. The community had learned valuable lessons about emergency preparedness, and they had proven their ability to work together in times of crisis. During her flight back to the city, Sarah reflected on the events of the past few weeks. The disaster had been tragic, with lives lost and homes destroyed. Jake and his crew had died trying to help people, which was a sobering reminder of the risks involved in humanitarian aviation. But the overall story was one of hope and resilience. A small mountain community had faced a devastating flood and had not only survived but had rebuilt itself to be stronger than before. The people of San Miguel had shown remarkable courage, determination, and unity in the face of disaster. Sarah realized that her role had been important but not unique. She had happened to be the pilot who reached the village first, but any experienced bush pilot would have done the same thing. The real heroes were the villagers themselves, who had faced catastrophe with dignity and had worked tirelessly to rebuild their community. As she landed at her home airport, Sarah was already planning future flights to San Miguel. The village would continue to need supplies and support during the rebuilding process, and she looked forward to watching the community continue to grow and prosper. The experience had reinforced her belief in the importance of humanitarian aviation. Small aircraft flown by experienced pilots could reach places that larger, more sophisticated aircraft could not. When disasters struck remote communities, sometimes a simple, reliable airplane was exactly what was needed to save lives. Sarah parked her Cessna in the hangar and walked toward the office to file her flight report. Tomorrow there would be other flights to other villages, carrying supplies to people who needed help. It was demanding work that required skill, courage, and dedication, but Sarah couldn't imagine doing anything else. The flooding at San Miguel had been a tragedy that became a story of triumph through the resilience of the human spirit and the power of communities working together. It was a reminder that even in our modern world of advanced technology, sometimes the simplest solutions, a skilled pilot in a reliable airplane, could make all the difference between life and death.